This is the beginning of our literature program. So in kindergarten, after the students learn to read, then in first grade, we get them out of controlled readers and into real books. So we had to be really careful in choosing these, that we chose books that they can read. And so the first couple are like, I can read books.
Right.
And deliberately, so that they are on the student's level, because these are the big difference between these and the read-alouds is these books, the students have to read to us.
That's right.
And so it has to be on their reading level, whereas the read-alouds are like a level above their reading level.
But that is not to say that we don't want to treat these books the same way that we've been treating the read-alouds in terms of pulling out what is intentional in them. And something that I think is important, that even though the child is reading the book, they still deserve repetitive treatment. Mm-hmm. And so, and something I experienced with my own children when I taught them to read, they would read a book and I would, celebrate that victory. But the effort that goes into reading the books, it really sort of detracts from their ability to comprehend.
Yeah.
And so this particular set of books requires sort of a real partnership in terms of the students reading what they can read, but then the parents' willingness to go back and reread so that the student can listen and then comprehend. Because the gap between phonics reading and comprehension isn't quite typically, not with every child, of course, but isn't quite operating in tandem, I think, with this particular set of books.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Ian here. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Novel Thoughts. This show only happens with your support, and that means the world to us. If you don't know already, all of the books we talk about on Novel Thoughts are available on our website at memoriapress.com, along with a ton of other great resources for homeschool families looking for great literature for their homes and classrooms. Thanks for being here. Now let's get back to the episode. So let's just begin. Let's work through them.
Okay.
So what are things that you see in Little Bear? Now, Little Bear, I think we want to say, is probably the most like a phonics reader book. And so perhaps there's not some of the major themes that we'll gush about like we did with our other read-alouds. But let's talk about it. Let's explain it. What are we doing?
Like, why did we choose Little Bear?
Sure.
To be out of
and
all
what do
the
we
many
see?
I can read books, why Little Bear?
Yeah.
Right.
What do we see in it?
Little Bear is just such a charming story. It's just pure innocence. And I think the young student can still relate to a lot of Little Bear's interests and antics. That's exactly right.
It's about imagination, the imagination of a young child.
That's right. And mother's relationship with Little Bear.
Yes.
Right.
The very first story where he's cold, he wants to go outside, but it's cold. So she starts giving him, she makes him a coat, she makes him a scarf, she makes him gloves, she makes him a hat, and he's still cold. And she says, do you need a fur coat?
Yeah.
And so she takes all that off of him and he goes outside.
And he's totally fine.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Yes.
So it just, there's a lot of silliness in it, but it's charming. It's a great way to start. And they can independently read it, hopefully, because it's also their first little chapter book.
Right.
The stories are very short. And they can have success in just a few pages.
And there is actually quite a bit to connect with other books, even in Little Bear. For instance, making soup for his friends. They're going to do that again in Stone Soup. And then at the end of the story, when he asks Mother to tell him a story, and it's basically all of his antics from the book, we see that again in Frog and Toad. And so,
nice connection.
in very simple ways, we can say, is that familiar to you? Have you seen that before? And just recognize, just connectivity, even if it's not some of the deeper things that we've talked about previously. Just the idea of connectivity in general is really valuable to the young student.
And I think, even as I think about it more, even after I ask the question, you are dealing with a book that's an I can read book. So it's dealing with very simple kinds of sentences and phrasings and things like that. But to develop some of those imaginary stories while using a very limited vocabulary is pretty good. It's a pretty well done job.
Yes.
That's right.
And a nice little relationship between Little Bear and his mother, and the comfort and the security of home, playing outside. in all
dressing
kinds of
up,
weather. Yes.
right, trying new things. And, that's something that was really important, I think, in all of our selections. We talked about this previously, but discernment, just the way the characters are interacting with each other's kindness is shown, and manners being modeled, and, those little small things that we can certainly pick up, friendships in these little books. I think, don't underestimate how meaningful those little tidbits are in these early books.
Well, let's move on to Frog and Toad are friends. And we've already mentioned a connection, that story where Frog and Toad are trying to tell each other stories in a little bear-like way. Frog, I believe, or is it Toad? I can't remember.
Frog tells Toad
the story that Toad couldn't come up with.
That's exactly right. Well, let's start at the beginning. What are things that you like in Frog and Toad are friends? And you said it's a classic and that we had to put it that it had to be. So why is that?
Frog and Toad is a classic. I mean, I remember reading Frog and Toad when I was little. This particular copy says we're celebrating 50 years of Frog and Toad. It's a Caldecott book, so as you can tell by the metal, which is for illustrations. And so, it is a classic. It's, those books that we talk about connecting, but classical education is about connecting generationally, right? And so it just adds meaning when I can say, I remember reading Frog and Toad when I was a little girl to my own children, and just sharing that experience with our children, I think in and of itself is a valuable thing.
And it stumped us. We didn't know that toads hibernate. We had researched that.
Yes, exactly.
And we learned that and that made it so much funnier. I mean, to be able to point that out to students that toads
don't hibernate, but toads do.
Yes. Toads hibernate. So no wonder Frog wanted Toad to get out of bed, because it was going to be from November till May that he didn't have his friend with him.
That's right. And it makes sense of what is kind of a deception, right? I mean, he deceives his friend by a month, but it's still kind of a joyful, friendly image. And it does make sense of Toad's character in that, it is May? Well, then I'll get up and go.
I feel good now.
That's fine. Yeah.
When 10 minutes ago he couldn't get out of bed, but as soon as he thought by the calendar that it was truly May, he was ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Frog and Toad are just the best of friends, but they're really quite different in personality. And so just pointing out that, sometimes opposites attract, and that we really can be, we don't have to look for identical people to just really bond with. And so, Toad's such a curmudgeon, and I just think that
the way that wears the swimsuit.
Yes. Yes.
Frog says, I don't wear a swimsuit.
And they all kind of make fun of him at the end, but it's still a funny story, and
just
cute and
just
charming.
The idea of personalities.
And again, broken down into short little stories that students can successfully read, and instead of just one big long book. We really are deliberately moving them step by step to comfort and security and confidence in being able to read.
Well, and I think you start to see that, because even as we move on from Frog and Toad are friends, you get to Caps for Sale, and we've discussed this before, what kind of value we see in this book. I mean, I think the illustrations I like the color in this. The color is very good. It's beautiful. But what do you guys see in Caps for Sale? What are the things that you like about it?
Is it 75 years old?
Does it say
it says that there, yeah.
75 years, right. Well, repetition is important in this book. You get a little bit of onomatopoeia, which is great. The gray caps, the brown caps, and that repetition is something that adds comfort to a student who's just learning to read independently. And so you really want to emphasize that repetition, because there might be a new word, but then immediately following is a word that they know, and they can kind of,
good.
And so, I would pay attention and exalt the repetition. But I think that this is a great book because these monkeys are watching everything that is happening here with this peddler.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is an easy book to take for granted, but wow, as a parent, what an important idea that we're always being watched and we're being imitated. And that these monkeys are throwing their caps down when the peddler does it. And, that's just I think a nice reminder for us as parents.
You're being watched.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I like about that very thing is this is teaching children how to read good literature, because as you're going throughout this particularly that sequence of events where he's getting madder and madder at the monkeys. Nowhere does the author say that the monkeys are imitating him.
Right.
That's a conceptual leap that the reader has to take. They have to recognize, the monkeys are doing exactly what he's doing,
Right.
and the author doesn't state that, so that when he gets to the scene where the peddler throws down his hat, you, as the reader, already know what's going to happen,
Right.
and you realize it solves his problem.
Right.
And so it's a great little
Right.
point in the literature,
Right.
but it's still funny. It's
That's
still
right. And again, to the extent that your student's interested and you have the time and interest in doing it, you can talk about anticipation
right.
and foreshadowing, and you can
Yeah.
these books are fantastic in terms of introducing really important literary devices to the point that you're ready for that, or your student's ready for that, or that it contributes to the experience and doesn't detract from it.
Yeah. And they may not get that the first time.
That's
I don't
right.
want to
That's right.
communicate
That's
that
right. That's
any
right.
first reading the student should understand that, but at some point they should. At some point they should get
That's
there.
right. And the first reading is really, as Leigh said earlier, is really going to be about reading.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that, after they get comfortable with it, and after we've read to them, and a lot of times we will read a page and then they read a page so that it is very familiar to them. So, just depending on what the student needs. But we're going to live with this book for several days.
Yeah.
And so hopefully we have had time to have those conversations. That's a huge part of it. It's not just, can you read this book? But we have really chosen classic books for this purpose because the content is important too.
And also, even a book like this honestly, simple books are sometimes the best books to use in other ways, because you're not bogged down with content or ideas or themes. I mean, you can even use this as a counting lesson, or, a lesson in patterns, or can you remember the sequence?
Color.
Or, right, exactly. And so, using the books to their fullest, picking out every gem and every nugget of goodness, truth, or beauty in these books is what we're really trying to train these young readers to do. And sometimes, these books that are repetitive and less wordy and things like that are the best books to sort of explore other benefits.